Podcasts on unctv.org are made possible through the financial contributions of viewers like you, who invite you to join them in supporting UNCTV.
From classroom teaching and research at UNC Charlotte to consulting with medical examiners in North Carolina and Quebec to 13 best-selling books, you have to ask, how can Kathy Reichs do it all? And that's what we'll ask her when we talk to her about her latest book, Spider Bones, maybe her best. We'll talk to her on North Carolina Book Watch next.
Funding for North Carolina Book Watch is made possible through the financial contributions of viewers like you, who invite you to join them in supporting UNCTV, and by the Mary Duke Biddle Foundation, Quail Ridge Books and Music, and the North Carolina Humanities Council.
Welcome to North Carolina Book Watch. I'm D.G. Martin, and my guest is Kathy Reichs. Kathy Reichs, welcome.
Thank you.
I shouldn't say welcome, because you've invited us into your house, and this is an extraordinary time for North Carolina Book Watch to be in the home.
Filming on location.
Yeah, on location with an author. Well, maybe you're not surprised. Maybe the people who read your books are not surprised, but from being a professor or assistant professor, associate professor at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte in anthropology, now 13 best-selling books, into the Bone series, and the Bone series reminds us that you're also involved in the production, and you've inspired the hit TV series Bones. Are you surprised by any of this?
Yeah. I mean, when you write a book, you just hope somebody will like it enough to publish it, and then somebody will like it enough to buy it and read it. You don't look that far down the road, so it's been shocking, I guess would be a better word than surprising.
Well, it's exciting for those of us in North Carolina to have any of our friends and fellow North Carolinians to be successful. And at the same time, we're just going to say, how did it happen? And we want to talk about Spider Bones, your latest book, but could you tell us a little bit about how anthropology and being a researcher and a teacher sort of led to this being an author? You weren't a trained writer, were you?
No, I really had I have no training in fiction anyway. I did a lot of scientific writing, but I made full professor and I was free to try something else, so I thought I'd give fiction a shot. I actually trained, if you want to go way back, to be a bioarchaeologist and look at ancient skeletons. But somewhere back in the early 80s, police started sending me cases. And once I started looking at modern skeletons, coroner, medical examiner cases, I found that a lot more compelling for me personally. So that's when I made the switch to forensics, and I retrained, became board certified. And then it was several years down the road from that I thought, well, this is interesting. People are kind of getting interested in forensics. Maybe I'll write the novel, write a fiction, because I could at that point do whatever I wanted to do at the university. So I did the novel, and that was a success. And then, of course, somewhere down the road, my agent said, well, why don't we, see if anyone's interested in Hollywood? And that gave the spin-off for the TV show, and the rest is history.
So it all just kind of happened along the way?
Yeah, none of it was pre-planned.
Well, I mean, that your work ethic shows through in terms of the kinds of things, a variety of things, and the number of things that you're involved in. And so the question is this a woman who's just got a terribly hard drive to succeed, or does she just do what she wants to do and all these kind of things sort of fall into place?
Now, are you talking about Kathy Reichs or Temperance Brennan?
I'm talking about, well, can you talk about either one without talking about the other? But I'm talking about Kathy Reichs now.
I don't know that I'm driven. I'm disciplined, and I get a lot done in the course of any given day. So, and I've always been double tasking. First it was mother and professor, then it was professor and forensic consultant, and then it was forensic consultant, and I entered the literary world, and then I moved from that to the literary world and the world of television. So I always like to have my foot in two different milieux, if you will.
Well, the other part of it that's interesting to me is that you've always kept one foot in North Carolina, but
Right.
both Tempe and you have another foot in Canada.
Right, yeah.
And how does that work?
That also started serendipitously. I went to Montreal on National Faculty Exchange back in 1980, when was that? 1989.
So this was from UNC Charlotte?
From UNC Charlotte, you change places with another professor at another institution. Often you change homes and you just change each other's lives for a year. So I went there and I was teaching at a university in Montreal when I started doing the lab work. The forensic lab wanted someone who could speak French and who was board certified. So I did the work there for that year, and then when I came back to UNC Charlotte, came back here where I live, to my home in Charlotte, we just figured out a way that I could commute to Montreal. So for years I have gone up every 6 weeks or every couple months.
So again, serendipitously, the association with the crime lab in Montreal developed because you happened to be there and they asked
Right.
you to help.
Right.
And then the personal associations and professional relationships were so productive that they're willing to
Right, yeah.
pay for you to come back
Yeah,
and help
yeah,
them some more.
yeah.
Well, that leads me to ask, both in North Carolina and Quebec, or in Montreal, and in these other places where you and Temperance Friendly go to assist in the crime labs or in the medical examiners' laboratories, I said, what in the world can an anthropologist contribute to the crime-solving effort? And what kinds of things did you start out doing, and then what did it lead to in terms of the things that you were able to do to help people identify bodies and solve crimes? What can bones tell you?
Well, mainly I address one of two questions. One would be identification, especially if they got a body that's completely unknown. Who is it? So we look at the age and the sex and the race and the height, and I give the detective all of those details because normally an ID is done with dental records or DNA, but you can't do that in a vacuum. You have to have a name. You have to know whose dentist to go to or whose family to go to. So I give them a profile, and then they match that against missing persons, and then they can come up with a name and get the dental records.
So the anthropologist can't tell who this person is, but you can look at bones and get age,
gender, medical history, height.
Sometimes ethnic clues as to ethnic background. And then the other people take those clues and merge them with clues
then
that
the
they got
detective does the traditional detective legwork and works with that. And then the second question I would address would be cause of death. What kind of trauma do I see in the skeleton that would tell me what happened to this person? And that, of course, is everything I work on isn't a homicide. Sometimes the death could have been accidental, sometimes it could have been natural. Someone wandered into the woods and died, and years later their skeleton is found.
So you'd find nothing in that skeleton?
I might find nothing, yeah. I might find evidence of, metastatic carcinoma or something that's entered the bones. Anything that leaves an impact on the bones, that would be what I would look at.
Well, I've started watching Bones on TV to sort of prepare myself for this, and find interesting that there's a division between scientists in the crime lab between flesh, examination of the flesh and the bones, and that there's a little bit of maybe a competitive interplay between who can find out the most, and what can you find out from flesh that you can't find out from bones, and what can you find out from bones that you can't find out from flesh?
You're asking about the difference between a traditional autopsy, which the pathologist would do, where you've got organs and you take out the brain and you take out the liver and you look microscopically at what's going on in those organs. You determine what stomach content is, for example. I get cases as an anthropologist where the body's compromised. It's burned or mummified or decomposed or dismembered or just bones. So you can't do those kinds of things. So you have to look at details in the skeleton to answer. You're really looking at the same questions, but you're answering it with different kinds of information.
Well, all of this comes to play in this wonderful new book that you've written, Spider Bones. And I wonder, I don't want to give away the story to the extent that you wouldn't want me to, so why don't you tell us a little bit about Spider Bones and its connections to North Carolina, or connections to Canada and the other places that you take us?
In every book, I draw on some case I've worked on or some experience I've had. And for several years, I consulted to the Central Identification Laboratory for the United States military out in Hawaii. It's called JPAC, the Joint POW MIA Accounting Commission. And my role would be anytime a service person is identified positively, that has to be reviewed at multiple levels, one of which is an external consultant who's a civilian. So that's what I did for years.
So that you were helping, in your own experience, this is nonfiction, you were
Right.
helping them with the, just to put it in a few words, identifying bodies of U.S. servicemen or possible U.S. servicemen to help
Right.
their families and everybody come to closure with
Exactly. And those would be service persons who died during World War II, Korea, Southeast Asia primarily. There are a number still missing from the Cold War, but mainly from those conflicts. So I drew on that experience of having to go to Hawaii twice a year, which is a really hard sell in January to your chairman at the university. And I would work on cases regularly here at home, but then I would go to the lab twice a year also, because part of the job was also overseeing the personnel there and how the lab was operating. So in Spider Bones, I used that experience. The story starts out where a body is discovered in Quebec under rather unusual circumstances, and they identify the body. But the problem is that it turns out that individual actually died back in 1968 in Vietnam.
Now this guy's name is John Lowry.
John Lowry, yeah, Spider, known as Spider, thus Spider Bones, the title. So our heroine is asked to step in and accompany the body back to the JPAC lab in Honolulu and to sort the mess out.
Can I back you up, because I'm more interested. This is your story. But first, she goes to North Carolina.
Right, because John Lowry, who died in the pond in Quebec, is supposedly buried in a grave in Lumberton, right here in the Carolinas. So if John Lowry just died now in 2010, then who was buried in this grave in 1968 in Lumberton? So she goes and performs an exhumation. And so they have a double problem of, well, who's the guy that they just dug up from the grave, and who is the person that died in Quebec?
So the bones that you start with are the bones that are buried in North Carolina in the gravesite of what we think is a Vietnam soldier who died and whose bones were identified and sent to North Carolina for burial.
Spider Lowry. Yeah.
But the same Spider Lowry dies in Quebec 30 years later, and you got to work that out. So you take that, excuse me, Tempe Brennan takes those bones to Hawaii, where these experts are, to sort out the mystery.
Right. And then, of course, nothing's ever easy for our heroine. While she's there, the medical examiner, the Honolulu medical examiner, asks her to step in on a current case. Some body parts wash ashore that appear to be the victims of a shark attack. So she's also brought into that while she's out there.
And then it gets to be even more complicated, and you finally, the story finally solves several mysteries as they come up.
Yes.
And it leads me to the, but before I do this, I don't want to leave the North Carolina connection. North Carolinians who read about a Lowry from Lumberton or from Robeson County, would guess or would ask the question, is this guy got a Lumbee Indian connection? So North Carolinians are a little bit ahead of your normal readers in coming up with one of the clues to a minor mystery, a minor mystery. And how do you lay in advance these clues that you want your readers to not capture, but then believe in?
Right.
When you
and I think that's part of the challenge of writing a thriller or a murder mystery, is that you do have to plant clues, because the fun of it is that the reader's trying to solve it before they get to the end of the book. Can they beat the author?
Yes.
Figure it out before the author gives them the answer. But every single clue has to make sense. You can have red herrings, but you have to resolve everything. by the time you finish the story. And they have to make sense, and you can't rely on coincidence, because I think that's very disappointing to me as a reader. So that's a challenge in doing that. I do it by very carefully, I write on a computer and I keep separate files for everything, and I track every clue that I've put in so that I make sure it makes sense, and I make sure that I tie it off and bring it back and explain it by the end of the
And
book.
do you toss in some clues that never resolve themselves, or do you feel like that if you
No,
put a
I
clue
feel
in,
like-
you got to have some?
I think if
So
you
if
put
I'm
it in,
reading it, I can say look for the clues and try to figure out in advance of when the author tells me, see if I can figure out how this might have an important association with solving
right.
the mystery.
And I think that's what the thriller reader does, is they're trying to crack the case before the end of the book.
Well, you've got lots of mysteries. The other interesting thing to me about your book, and I want to know why you do this, and that is that in addition to the mysteries, there are, gosh, will you forgive me for this, but there are soap opera qualities to the relationships between the main characters' families, and the main characters' ex-boyfriend, ex-romantic interest. All of these things, are they there just to add spice? Or what?
They're there. I think the reader needs to care about the character. And if you don't see the character in anything but a workplace situation, you know, it's really hard to care. So when I created Temperance Brennan, I wanted a character that would have strength and a good sense of humor, but also some flaws and some problems that she's having to deal with in her personal life. So yeah, things get a bit complicated. She doesn't think. She invites Andrew Ryan, the detective from Montreal, to come out. She's got this big house out in Hawaii. She and her daughter are there. Her daughter Katie are there because Katie has suffered a tragedy of her own. So Ryan is having difficulty with his daughter, Lily, and that we've met in previous books. We know that Lily has had a drug problem. So Tempe impetuously says, well, come on out here, bring Lily out here. The girls will get along. Well, the girls don't get along very well. So that adds this whole subtext.
Well, I love that, because I did start to care about these characters. I kept asking the question, I want to get on with the crime mystery. Mm-hmm. What are we doing with all of these domestic consequences? But I did care more about and realize the humanity of your main character. Well, one of the other, I've got 1,000 other questions, and we're running out of time, but one of the challenges that you've got 13 books, and I think all of them are narrated, led by Temperance Brennan. I mean,
right.
she's and you use the same characters throughout the series, but how do you write a book in which the characters are familiar to those people who've read the other series, and yet you want somebody who's reading this book only to have their feet on the ground? How do you do that?
That's a big challenge in a continuing character series, because you have to introduce the character and the basic situation, the premise, in every book. But you don't want to bore your returning readers.
Right.
But you have to introduce them for your brand new reader. That might be their first Temperance Brennan novel. So you really have to come up with ways to say the same things in different ways in every single book. And that is challenging.
So that you're giving your old readers a little bit of extra information, but the new reader, it's introductory material that will help put this character in place.
Right. Yeah.
Also, you used, there are a lot of characters in your book. Now, how do you decide how many is too many characters?
Sometimes I don't decide well, and my editor will say, ooh, it's a lot of characters. Do we need so-and-so? Sometimes as I'm writing, I'll just take out a whole character, obliterate a whole character. It's hard for me to say how I know. I just have a sense that this is too many and people aren't going to keep them straight. I like to take characters that I've had in previous novels in a very minor role and then bring them in as major characters in a subsequent book. I do that quite often.
One of the challenges that you have of writing novels must be a little bit different from the challenge that you and the writers in the TV series Bones have. And what have you learned about writing for television that is different? What are the different challenges and what are
Yeah.
the different approaches that writers take?
There are some ways in which it's similar. You will have an A story and a B story, sometimes a C story, and that's really what we were talking about just before this, is that the main story is John Lowry, and then the B story is the shark victims, and then the C story is what's going on with Lily and Katie. So in that way, it's structured similarly. The way television writing is different is that it's collective. I'm used to sitting at my computer all by myself and writing my book, and when it's finished, I turn it into my editor. Well, with TV writing, you do it as a group in the writer's room with the other writers. At least you break the story that way, which means you start with an empty wall broken down into 6 acts, and then you plot the whole thing out together. What's your A story, your B story, your C story? How do you close out each act, which is similar to what I do with each chapter. You want to close.
But you do it by yourself. In this case, you do it
And in
collectively.
television, you do it collectively. Then once your outline is approved, you're sent home, and then you write the script alone. But the next big difference is you have a lot of bosses to answer to. It has to be approved by the showrunner, who's the executive producer, by the network, by the studio, and all of them have different things that they're looking for that they like and dislike.
Are the stories different? Let me ask the question this way. Could Spiderbones, a story that's very captivating in print, can you imagine that it could be a television? Could you, or do the stories have to be a little bit different for television?
I could see where that could be condensed down into either television or a feature film. Yeah, but it would have to be. And the other thing that's different is you take out any any descriptive material, because you see that visually. You don't have to describe a scene or the room or how someone enters. It really boils down to dialogue and some simple directives for action. So that's really different from writing a novel.
Well, we talked a little bit earlier about the family connections that your heroine, Tempe, has. And the dynamics of the relationship between Tempe and her daughter do turn out to be very important. And everybody asks, are you Tempe? Well, talk about your family. And you've got a daughter and a son and a husband.
I do.
And tell us a little bit about
my
what's
daughter
going on.
Carrie is also, I have two offspring that are attorneys, neither of which practices law. They're both writers now.
Both grew up here in Charlotte.
Yes, all 3 of my kids. My middle daughter, Courtney, is a nurse at Presbyterian Orthopedic.
Is still here.
Is still here, yeah. Carrie is now writing. Her first book came out, I think, 2 years ago, The Best Day of Someone Else's Life. And she has just recently released Leaving Unknown. Brendan and I have written together the first in a series of young adult books, which is called Virals. And that will be out November 2nd. It will be a series, there will be at least 3 of those, and it's called the Virals series. And it takes place in Charleston, South Carolina, so it's very much Carolina-based.
So you all are working together.
Yes.
Now, how?
Yeah.
Let's get back to the original question. How do you work? How do you allocate time between television, between writing a book almost every year, and now a new series of books, and all of the other things, and promoting the books? How do you
doing
manage
casework, and
and
continuing
and
to do
keeping
forensic
alive in the
casework.
profession?
Yeah. I do a book a year, every year, and then this year I did 2 books with Brendan, of course, and then the screenplay for the show. So this year had 2 grandbabies born. So this was really a busy year for me.
You're telling. I mean, but now how? How do you? Let's simplify the question. How do you write? What is your? Do you have a discipline for writing, or do you just write when you can?
I write every minute that I can. If I'm not traveling on tour or traveling to do casework in the lab, I stay home all day and I write. I try to get at the computer by about 8 in the morning, and I stay with it till 5 or 6 at night. I break, for lunch and maybe to work out. Right.
Well, you talked to us about how on writing for television, you outline the whole story and then go home to write. Now, do you have a parallel in the sense that when you write your book that you have outlined in pretty much detail what the story is, and that you're writing to fill in the details?
I did with the first couple of Temperance Brennan novels. I don't so much anymore. I have a very loose outline. I know how the first 5 or 6 chapters, I'll outline those, and then the final scene, and I know where the story's going, but I do much more of a free flow with the Temperance Brennan. The Viral series, which stars Tori Brennan, Temperance Brennan's 14-year-old niece, and takes place in Charleston, is a little bit different process from the Temperance Brennan series. With the Viral series, what I do is a very detailed outline. And then we take each chapter and expand the chapters. Brendan and I agree on how the story is going to flow, and then we have probably 1 paragraph on each chapter, and then we expand that out to make it into a full novel.
So it's a little bit closer in the collaborative writing style of television, that you assign different parts, get a little bit stricter or more detailed outline, and then watch it develop.
Yeah, and also that I have someone else I have to answer to. Working with my son is a very interesting experience. We have very animated, creative meetings, shall we say, editorial meetings.
Well, we'll look not only with great anticipation for your next book, but your next book written in collaboration with your son. And we'll also be keeping a lookout for the books that your daughter is writing.
Oh, thank you.
A whole literary clan here in Charlotte.
Yes, a dynasty begins.
Thanks so much, Kathy Rice.
Thank you.
Our guest has been Kathy Rice, author of Spider Bones. Thanks to all y'all for listening. We'll be back right here, same time, to introduce you to the work of another great North Carolina writer.
Funding for North Carolina Book Watch is made possible through the financial contributions of viewers like you, who invite you to join them in supporting UNC-TV, and by the Mary Duke Biddle Foundation, Quail Ridge Books and Music, and the North Carolina Humanities Council.
Podcasts on unctv.org are made possible through the financial contributions of viewers like you, who invite you to join them in supporting UNC-TV.